Julian Vance had spent 10 long years working his way into Clara Sterling's orbit. He had gone from a nameless admirer to her publicly acknowledged fiancée. But now, with only 2 weeks left until the wedding, he decided he didn't want it anymore. "Professor Miller, I'm volunteering for the transfer to the New Mexico field office. Please add my name to the roster." Julian placed the signed application on the desk, his voice steady. The woman behind the computer looked up, her expression one of pure shock. "Julian, I thought you and Clara were getting married next month." She paused, leaning back. "Everyone in the department knows you only came to this institute to be with her. You're finally about to cross the finish line, and you want to head out to the desert now." Julian forced down the bitterness rising in his throat. "Please just approve it, Sarah." Everyone who knew him understood how hard he had worked to stand beside Clara Sterling. He had turned down prestigious promotions just to remain her assistant. Clara was a woman who detested physical proximity, yet Julian had shown a level of patience that bordered on the superhuman. He had spent a decade making himself a fixture in her life, handling every mundane detail of her existence and shielding her from the social interactions she loathed. To the outside world, Clara treated him with a unique kind of favor. The reclusive, Ice Queen genius of the Sterling lab actually remembered his birthday. She even let him stay in the private lounge of her office when he wasn't feeling well. But Julian knew the truth. The birthday gift was always a large Venmo transfer because she didn't want to spend the mental energy picking out a present. And that night, he stayed in the lounge. She had worked through the night in the next room, leaving him to shiver with a fever and a hacking cough, never once checking on him. No one knew that Clara had only agreed to marry him because of a kidnapping attempt 2 months ago. Clara had been targeted, and Julian had broken into the abandoned warehouse alone. To protect her, he had become the new target for the thugs. They had kicked him to the ground, the sound of a lead pipe hitting his back echoing with a sickening thud. He hadn't made a sound. Infuriated, they had slammed his head against the cold concrete. He had bought enough time for the police to arrive and rescue Clara, but he nearly died from his injuries. When he finally woke up, Clara, who rarely left her lab for anything, was sitting by his bed. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice raspy. "We should meet our parents and set a wedding date." After years of knowing her, Julian could clearly read the look in Clara's eyes. It was debt. She was marrying him out of guilt. He had selfishly accepted the proposal anyway, just for the chance to stay. If Leo Crawford hadn't appeared, Julian might have spent the rest of his life lying to himself. As Julian left the administration building, a large monitor in the plaza was broadcasting a live stream from the Global Tech Summit. A group of grad students stood under the screen, whispering excitedly. "Look, it's Dr. Sterling and Leo Crawford. They look so good together. I heard Leo's latest paper was personally mentored by her. Someone as cold as Dr. Sterling personally mentoring a junior? I guess even an iceberg can be melted by a guy like Leo." The noise around him made Julian feel dizzy. The entire institute was buzzing about how perfect Leo and Clara were together. Meanwhile, despite a decade of service, few even knew Julian was her actual fiancé. Julian looked up at the screen. In a close-up, Leo was leaning in to whisper something to Clara. She tilted her head slightly to listen. They were close, so close their shoulders touched, yet she showed no signs of discomfort. The woman who had once demanded a 3-meter safety zone, even when Julian reported on research data, was now allowing another man's breath to brush against her ear. He used to think the boundaries she drew were impenetrable. But Leo's arrival had revealed a side of Clara Sterling he had never seen. He remembered the first time he heard Leo's name from her. She had been looking at a mess of data, but a faint, genuine smile had played on her lips. Leo mixed up the sample sequence again, she had said. There was no reprimand in her voice, only a strange sense of indulgence. Leo was the son of their former mentor, a golden boy who had been fast-tracked into the lab. He was like the California sun, loud, bold, and unapologetic. He would snatch the stylus right out of Clara's hand to finish a calculation, or hand her his coffee to take a sip, or even slap her shoulder and laugh while she was deep in thought. And Clara had changed. From the initial stiffening of her body when Leo got close, to eventually allowing him to clutter her desk. She would accept drinks he offered, drinks she normally hated, and she would actually look at him and smile when he told a joke. The breaking point had been when Julian saw Leo lean down and kiss Clara on the cheek in the lab. Clara, the woman who would flinch if Julian's fingers accidentally brushed hers, simply froze for a second, her cheeks flushing a soft pink. She hadn't pushed him away. Julian finally realized that when Clara Sterling actually liked someone, she was just like any other girl. Her heartbeat went haywire, and her principles crumbled. Julian returned to the townhouse he had bought for their future home. Since the renovations were finished, Clara hadn't stepped foot in it once. He calmly walked into the walk-in closet and began taking down his clothes. All the carefully selected home decor, the domestic life he had fantasized about sharing with her, it all felt like a silent mockery. He found some boxes and packed away every trace of his existence, scheduling a courier to pick them up. As he finished, his phone lit up. It was the official notification that his transfer to the New Mexico field office had been approved. Almost simultaneously, a text came in from Clara, Flight A2415, arriving at Logan at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Pick me up. Julian looked at the message for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and typed 3 words. I can't tonight. Julian moved fast. Within 24 hours, the house was scrubbed clean of his presence. When the real estate agent brought a client by for a viewing, there was no sign that anyone had ever lived there. He was like a ghost who had spent 10 years haunting Clara Sterling's life without leaving a single footprint. Mr. Vance, are you sure you want a quick sale? With this location and the custom renovations, you're losing a lot of money at this price. I'm sure, Julian said, his voice flat. The sooner the better. He had bought this house full of hope. Now that he was leaving, it was just a pile of bricks. The Institute required him to finish a handover before he could leave, meaning he had to stay in Boston for 2 more weeks. The day Clara and Leo returned, it was pouring rain. Julian was in the lab organizing data when his phone buzzed. A text from Clara just landed. In the past, no matter how late it was or how bad the weather, Julian would have dropped everything the moment he saw those words. Once, even with a high fever, he had forced himself to drive to the airport, only to pass out in the cell phone lot while waiting for her. Clara had ended up taking an Uber back to the lab. When she found out later, she had simply said, if you're sick next time, don't bother coming. There was no concern, only a statement of fact. He had spent weeks agonizing over that don't bother, thinking he had failed her. Julian turned off the screen and went back to his data. The department held a small welcome-back dinner for Clara and Leo. Julian didn't want to go, but the department chair personally invited him, and he couldn't find a reason to refuse. He arrived late and took a seat in a far corner. The dinner was halfway through, and the stars of the show were Clara and Leo, who was sitting right next to her. Leo was animatedly telling stories from the summit, keeping the table in stitches. Even Clara sat there quietly, showing no sign of her usual impatience. When Leo got excited and grabbed her shoulder to shake her playfully, she only gave a small frown but didn't pull away. Man, yesterday was a nightmare, Leo said, changing the subject. His eyes drifted to Julian in the corner. Flight was delayed, then it was a torrential downpour. Dr. Sterling and I waited forever for a ride. Our suitcases got soaked. He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. Julian, I remember you used to handle all the airport runs. Why didn't you show up this time? In an instant, every eye at the table was on Julian, filled with curiosity and judgment. Julian put down his fork, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and met Leo's faux innocent gaze. Organizing airport transportation is not part of my job description. The smile on Leo's face stiffened. Clara, sitting at the head of the table, finally looked at him. Her face was expressionless, but Julian saw the flash of surprise in her eyes. Of course, she was used to it, used to his meticulous arrangements, used to him being there whenever she needed something. He was like the air, ignored when present, but a source of slight discomfort when missing. The meal ended in a strained atmosphere. As the group dispersed, Clara intercepted Julian at the end of the hallway. What's wrong with you? She asked, her voice its usual cool, flat tone. Julian stopped and looked at her. The hallway lights cast shadows over her sharp, elegant features. He had once thought that being able to look at her like this for the rest of his life would be a blessing. What do you mean? Leo was just asking a question, Clara said, pausing as if trying to find the right words to explain. He was a huge help at the summit. You're my personal assistant. These logistics are usually. Julian knew what she was thinking. She thought he was throwing a jealous tantrum because of Leo, and that he had embarrassed her on purpose. Clara, it was the first time he had ever called her by her name without her title. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut her off mid-sentence. She looked at him, seemingly stunned that he would interrupt her. I'm not throwing a tantrum, and this isn't about who you went to the summit with. Julian met her eyes, a dull ache throbbing in his chest. He took a deep breath and said the words that had been circling in his mind for weeks. Our engagement, let's call it off. Clara's brow furrowed. What did you say? Before she could process it, Leo ran down the hallway. Dr. Sterling, there's an issue with sample 3. Clara immediately turned to him. What happened? The threshold is spiking. You need to see this. Leo grabbed her wrist. She glanced back at Julian, her tone dismissive. This is an emergency. We'll talk about this later. With that, she followed Leo, disappearing around the corner without giving Julian another second of her time. Julian stood there, his face blank. He wasn't surprised. With her, everything was more important than him. And her later almost certainly meant never. She had never asked a single question about the wedding anyway. She was just showing up for the ceremony. Now that he had notified her, his obligation was done. Since he had put the townhouse up for sale and his lease on his old apartment had already ended, Julian realized he had nowhere to go. Half an hour later, Julian stood at the door of a modest suburban house. His mother opened the door, a wide, eager smile appearing the moment she saw him. "Julian, what are you doing here? Where's Clara? Did she come up?" Julian squeezed past her. "She's not here." In the living room, his father and his younger brother, Gabe, were sprawled on the couch with their feet on the coffee table. Hearing the noise, his father turned around, looking past Julian toward the door. "Where's the doctor? Is she parking the car? We broke up." The air in the room froze. "What?" His father's smile vanished. He stood up abruptly, his voice rising. "Broke up? What the hell does that mean?" "It means the engagement is canceled." "We're done," Julian repeated, his voice monotone. Smash! His father kicked the glass coffee table over. Trays of fruit and mugs shattered across the floor. Scalding hot tea splashed onto Julian's leg, a sharp, burning sting radiating through his skin. "You useless failure." His father's face turned purple, a vein throbbing in his temple. "I raised you better than this. Clara Sterling is a once-in-a-lifetime catch. You think you could just walk away?" Gabe, still sitting on the couch, spoke up with a sneer. "Bro, honestly, Dr. Sterling is elite. Everyone around her is a genius." He looked Julian up and down with a scoff. "Besides your face, what do you actually bring to the table? You were lucky she even looked at you. If you had any self-awareness, you'd have sucked it up and stayed in your lane." Gabe continued. "Women just need to be pampered a bit. You're throwing a fit now, but who's going to pay for my wedding? You're screwing over your own brother." Julian looked at the three faces before him, twisted by greed and resentment. His leg burned, but it was nothing compared to the ice in his heart. This was his family. He had once craved warmth from this house, even a fake version of it. Almost every penny he earned had been poured into this bottomless pit. Gabe's tuition for a third-tier college, the retirement fund his parents constantly demanded, the down payment for their house. He had given until he was numb, still holding onto a tiny, pathetic hope. It was only when Clara agreed to marry him that their attitudes had changed. The phone calls became frequent, the tone became warm. They had even started asking if he was tired. He had been naive enough to think it was late-onset love, that they finally saw his value. Now the mask was gone. They didn't care about Julian Vance. They cared about the resources they could squeeze out of Clara Sterling. Julian didn't say another word. He didn't even tend to the burn on his leg. He grabbed his suitcase from the hallway and turned to leave. "Where do you think you're going? You think you can just walk out because we told you the truth? Don't bother coming back. See who treats you like a person then." Julian slammed the door, cutting off the shouting. The motion sensor lights in the old hallway flickered. He leaned against the wall and took a jagged breath. The world was huge, and yet he had nowhere to go. Julian managed to get the keys to a temporary dorm room from the Institute's housing office. It was a tiny room on the top floor, but it would suffice for the next 2 weeks. He was carrying a heavy cardboard box filled with books and personal items up the stairs when he ran into Clara and Leo coming down. Leo was laughing at something Clara said, nearly bumping into Julian. "Whoa," Leo said, reaching out to steady the box as it slipped in Julian's arms. "Julian, what are you moving? This looks heavy. Let me help you out." Leo's smile was bright and helpful. Julian tightened his grip, pulling the box away. "I've got it, thanks." "Come on, man. I've got plenty of muscle," Leo said, reaching for it again. Suddenly, Clara stepped forward and took the box from Julian's hands. Leo laughed. "Dr. Sterling, those hands are for precision experiments. They're national treasures. You shouldn't be doing heavy lifting." When Clara looked at Leo, her eyes held a trace of a smile Julian had never seen. A playful, indulgent look. "As if you're any more delicate than I am," she teased. The words were soft, but they felt like a needle to Julian's heart. When he had first started as her assistant, he had once tried to carry a massive stack of journals. He had dropped them, and they scattered everywhere. Clara had just happened to walk by. He had been frantic and embarrassed, terrified she'd think he was incompetent. She had just looked at the mess, said nothing, didn't help him pick up a single book, and later had HR order him a rolling cart. She never told him, "I've got it," and she certainly never used that tone with him. Leo chuckled, his ears turning slightly red. "You making fun of me again?" Clara didn't reply, simply asking Julian, "What floor?" "Fourth," Julian answered, his voice dry. The two of them walked up the stairs ahead of him, still chatting. Leo was telling a story about some data error, and Clara was responding with genuine interest. Julian followed a few paces behind. It was a familiar sight. For 10 years, he had spent most of his time following her, watching her back. Now, there was just someone else in the space between them. He was a surplus shadow, trying to catch up, but never truly part of her world. At the door to room 402, Julian unlocked it. The dorm was basic: a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a small bathroom. It was clean but cramped. Clara set the box down on the floor. She finally seemed to notice the state of the room, looking around before turning back to Julian. "Why are you staying in a dorm?" Julian pulled his suitcase in. "I sold the townhouse." He stopped, waiting for a reaction. A question, a look of shock, anything, but there was only a brief silence. Then, Clara spoke, her voice unchanged. "If you don't like it here, buy another place. There's no need to suffer in a dorm." Julian slowly straightened up. She didn't care. She didn't care about the house. She didn't care why he moved out. She probably hadn't even taken his breakup seriously. Leo stood behind Clara, a small, subtle smirk on his face. "We'll leave you to unpack, Julian. Dr. Sterling and I have to head to the data center." Clara gave a small nod of farewell and turned to leave with Leo. Julian stood alone in the empty doorway, looking at the red marks on his hands from the box. Suffer? The real suffering was the years of being invisible. The real suffering was having his devotion met with Venmo transfers, his life-saving sacrifice met with a guilt-driven engagement, and always being second to someone who could actually make her laugh. The bitterness finally flooded in, drowning his heart and clogging his throat. The next few days were quiet. Julian had just finished a data simulation and was packing up his station when a colleague, Sarah, burst in, her face pale. "Julian, quick, your mom and brother are at the main gate causing a scene. Security can't stop them." Julian's heart sank. He had cut off the money to his parents the day he moved out. He should have known they wouldn't wait. He could hear Gabe's shouting and his mother's wailing before he even reached the gate. A crowd had already gathered. Martha Vance was sitting on the ground, wailing and slapping her thighs. "It's a disgrace. My son becomes a big shot and forgets the parents who raised him." Gabe was pointing a finger in a security guard's face. "Get lost. I'm here to see my brother. It's family business." Julian pushed through the crowd. "Mom, Gabe, what are you doing?" "What are we doing?" Gabe shoved past the guard and got into Julian's face. "You think you're clever? I'm 20,000 short for my wedding, and you're going to give it to me today." "The monthly allowance I give you is more than enough for the family," Julian said, his voice cold. "I don't have a cent for your wedding." "Bullshit. You were generous enough when you were sucking up to Clara Sterling. Now that she dumped you, you're acting broke." Gabe suddenly lunged forward and gave Julian a violent shove. "Give me the money." Caught off guard, Julian fell backward, hitting the hard marble ground with a heavy thud. His elbows and knees scraped against the stone, and blood began to seep through his clothes. The crowd went silent. Julian tried to stand, but sharp pain in his knee pinned him down. The humiliation of being shoved to the ground by his own brother in front of his colleagues was more painful than the scrapes. He looked up at the people he had spent a decade supporting. "I said I don't have it. You want to play hardball?" Gabe snapped. He reached into a nearby planter and grabbed a heavy metal decorative ornament, raising it over his head. The crowd gasped. Just as Gabe swung it down, a figure blurred past Julian. Clank! The dull sound of metal hitting flesh and bone echoed. It was Clara. She had appeared out of nowhere, shielding Julian with her body, taking the full force of the metal ornament on her back. She let out a muffled groan, her face contorting in pain, but she didn't move. Julian stared at her in shock. Gabe's legs went weak, and he nearly collapsed. Martha turned white as a sheet. Her son had just struck Clara Sterling. This wasn't just about money anymore. Their whole world was about to end. "Call the police." Clara's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Assault on a research fellow and a threat to public safety. Secure the surveillance footage." The sirens were audible within minutes. Gabe and Martha looked like ghosts as they were led away. Martha was still screaming, "Julian, I'm your mother. You can't do this to us." Julian watched them being put into the squad car. As the crowd dispersed, the weight of the stairs felt like lead on his back. He tried to stand but stumbled. Clara caught him, her eyes scanning his injuries. "Go to the infirmary." Julian looked up at her. Something about the way her eyes were cast down reminded him of high school. Back then, Clara was already a legend, a math prodigy whose name was always at the top of the honor roll. Even then, she was distant and cold, but she was the idol of every boy in school. Julian had been mediocre, invisible, and ignored by his parents. Their lives should never have touched. But once, after his father had beaten him until he was limping because of something Gabe had lied about, Julian had sat in the corner of the gym, unable to move and unwilling to let anyone see him. He had waited for everyone to leave, only to hear footsteps returning. It was Clara. She had placed a bottle of antiseptic and some gauze next to him. "They're all gone," she had said, her eyes politely avoiding his bruised ankle. "It's raining. No one will see you." He remembered her wet hair and damp shoulders. In that moment, the roar of his own heart had drowned out the rain. He was surplus at home and transparent at school, but the girl he didn't even dare to admire had protected his fragile dignity. She had given him a single spark of light, and he had spent 10 years flying into the flame. "Julian," her voice pulled him back. The nurse was cleaning his wounds. Clara was standing by the door, her expression flat. "Handle your family matters. Don't let it interfere with the work." The words were like ice water, dousing the tiny spark of warmth her protection had ignited. Her intervention wasn't about him. It was about the fact that the scene was a nuisance to her life. He looked down and simply nodded. After his wounds were dressed, Clara checked the time. "There's a faculty dinner tonight. Come with me." The dinner was lively, the conversation naturally revolving around the lab's recent breakthroughs. Leo was sitting next to Clara, regaling everyone with stories from his time abroad. Professor Crawford, Leo's father, was beaming with pride at his son and his star pupil. The professor's eyes drifted between Clara and Leo, and he smiled. "Clara, this collaboration with Leo went so well. You two complement each other, one steady, one sharp. Professionally and personally, you're a great match." He leaned in slightly. "You're not getting any younger. You shouldn't just bury yourself in books." Leo can be a bit impulsive, but his heart is in the right place. The implication couldn't have been clearer. The people at the table who knew about Julian and Clara's engagement went silent, their eyes darting toward Julian. Leo's ears turned red, but he looked at Clara with blatant expectation. Julian kept his head down, staring at the tea leaves in his cup. Clara was silent for a few seconds. "Thank you for the concern, Professor, but my focus is on the project right now. I'm not thinking about that." Leo's face went pale. He looked at Clara in disbelief, then abruptly stood up and ran out of the room. "Lao!" Professor Crawford called out. Clara watched him go, a small frown appearing on her face. She stood up. "Professor, I'll go check on him." The room fell into an awkward silence. Sarah leaned over to Julian and whispered, "Julian, why didn't Clara mention you two are engaged? Should I say something to Professor Crawford?" Julian shook his head. "Don't bother. A relationship that the person involved won't even acknowledge is just a joke." A few minutes later, Julian's stomach felt knotted. He excused himself and left the room. He didn't go to the restroom. He walked out to the quiet courtyard behind the restaurant. The night air was cool, clearing the heat and the smell of alcohol. And then he saw them. Under a crabapple tree, Leo was holding Clara in a desperate hug. His muffled voice carried through the air. "Why not? I love you. I know I'm not as mature or steady as Julian, but I'll work at it. Anything he does, I can do too." Clara didn't return the hug, but the fact that she was allowing it said everything. Julian remembered the few times he had tried to initiate a hug, and the subtle, instinctive way she had always pulled back. At that moment, Clara seemed to sense someone watching. She looked up. Julian's face was a mask of indifference as he looked back at her, as if he were watching a movie that had nothing to do with him. Only his hands, clenched at his sides with nails digging into his palms, betrayed him. Clara's pupils seemed to contract. Leo, lost in his grief, noticed nothing. "I understand you better than he does. I know how to make you happy." Julian didn't wait. He turned and walked away. Back in the room, he apologized and said he wasn't feeling well. Sarah looked at him with concern, but said nothing. He walked back to the dorm alone, the ashes in his heart blowing away in the wind. He was about to sleep when there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find Clara standing in the dim light of the hallway. Julian didn't invite her in. He just looked at her. She was silent for a long moment. "About Leo." "I turned him down." She paused. "Don't overthink it." Julian was surprised. He had expected her to tell him they were together. But here she was, telling him she had rejected Leo. She was even explaining things because she was worried he'd overthink. His voice was flat. "Whether you accept him or not has nothing to do with me anymore." Clara looked stunned by his indifference. "If that's all, I need to sleep." "Julian," Clara's hand shot out, grabbing the door frame to stop him from closing it. Her voice dropped. "You've been acting very strange lately." Julian didn't answer. He looked away and shut the door. The click of the lock echoed in the small room. He leaned against the door and exhaled slowly. A faint, dull ache throbbed in his chest, like rust eating away at iron. It wasn't like Clara to explain herself. He had never heard her say words she deemed superfluous. In the past, he had lived and breathed for her every mood, and she had ignored him. Now he had watched her get confessed to and felt nothing, and she had come to clarify why. A mixture of absurdity and faint sorrow washed over him. He was eventually startled by the ringing of his phone. Julian, did you see the internal portal? The new top-tier journal acceptance notice. The new materials paper. Why is Leo Crawford the lead author? Wasn't that your and Clara's project? You spent months on those measurements. Julian's heart plummeted. What did you say? Check the system. Leo is the only author listed. Clara isn't even on it. What is going on? Julian immediately opened his laptop. On the portal, the headline was unmistakable. Congratulations to Leo Crawford for his first author publication in Materials Frontiers. Materials Frontiers was the top journal in the field, and the title of the paper was the project Julian and Clara had poured their souls into for months. Julian had come up with the initial concept, Clara had helped refine it, and Julian had spent 3 months in the lab to get the critical data. Based on contribution, the first author should have been Julian. If not him, then Clara. But the only name listed was Leo Crawford. Even Clara's name was missing, making it look like she was just a selfless mentor. He immediately called Clara. What happened with the paper credits? Clara's voice was as calm as ever. I rejected Leo's confession. He was devastated. It was going to affect his performance review for his tenure track. Julian almost laughed. So, you used our research results to comfort him. You used my work as a consolation prize? Did you even think to ask me? Did I agree to this? Clara's response was evasive. The data was there. He organized the first draft. It's appropriate for him to have the credit. This paper belongs to the Institute, she continued. I have the authority to decide authorship. Your contribution will be recognized in later projects. Julian's voice trembled with a mix of hurt and rage. 3 months of his life had been erased by Clara and handed over to someone else as a stepping stone. How pathetic was he, feeling bad about her explanation earlier, when it was clearly just her trying to clear her conscience before stealing his work. Recognized? How? Like always? A tiny mention in the acknowledgments? Clara, what am I to you? Just a tool in your lab who doesn't need credit, only work. There was silence on the line. When she finally spoke, the words were the final nail in the coffin for Julian. Julian, didn't you come to the Institute just so you could work by my side? Julian's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. She continued, her logic cold and clear. These titles don't matter to you. As long as you're on my team, I can guarantee you a stable, worry-free career. But Leo is different. He needs these results to establish himself in this field and move forward. The world seemed to hum in Julian's ears. Everything went cold. She knew. She had always known he had given up his own career path to be her assistant. She wasn't oblivious. She just didn't care. And she had used his devotion as a reason to treat his hard work as a disposable asset. 10 years of loyalty had proved his courage. But to her, it just proved he was someone who didn't care about unimportant things like credit. He opened his mouth to argue, to ask how she dared decide what was important to him, to ask if she had any idea how many nights he had stayed up to get those numbers. But he was just too tired. He hung up. The Institute held a major academic seminar shortly after. The paper credited to Leo, published in a top journal, was one of the highlights. Leo was the keynote speaker. He was dressed in a sharp suit, articulating the core findings of the paper. The audience whispered in admiration. Everything was going perfectly until the Q&A. An anonymous online participant posted a comment in the public chat. I question Mr. Crawford's academic integrity. The core data in this paper is nearly identical to Julian Vance's early lab logs. How does Mr. Crawford explain the data source? Is this a case of stealing a colleague's results? The room exploded into murmurs. The comment was projected on the big screen for everyone to see. Leo went white, his eyes darting frantically to Clara in the front row. The moderator tried to regain control, but the noise was too loud. Julian's heart leaped. He sat up straight. This wasn't him. He hadn't planned on burning everything down this way. Then he felt a gaze. He looked up and met Clara's eyes. She was looking at him through the crowd, her brow furrowed with deep disappointment. She didn't need to say a word. He read everything in her look. She didn't even have to ask. She was certain that he had made the anonymous post out of spite. In her eyes, he was someone who would destroy the Institute's reputation just to hurt Leo. Clara stood up. Under the curious gaze of the audience, she walked onto the stage. She took the microphone from a frozen Leo. I am Dr. Clara Sterling. Regarding the anonymous allegation, I will clarify. This research was conducted under my full supervision. Leo Crawford is the primary researcher, and I vouch for the integrity of this work with my own professional reputation. She paused, her eyes sweeping over Julian's pale face. Julian Vance is my assistant. He handled administrative and supportive tasks, but lacks the core expertise to have conducted this research independently. This achievement belongs to Leo Crawford, without question. The room was in an uproar. The lead scientist herself is vouching for him. So Julian was just a clerk? No wonder his name isn't on it. Must have been a misunderstanding. Julian felt like he had been stripped naked and thrown into a frozen lake. Clara looked at Leo, whose eyes were red. Leo, please continue with the presentation. Clara's words were a knife that stabbed into Julian's heart and twisted. The contemptuous looks from his colleagues pinned him to a cross of shame. Supportive tasks? Administrative? Lacks core expertise? She had publicly negated his entire worth as a scientist just to pave the way for another man. The flash of triumph in Leo's eyes was the final straw. Anger and humiliation surged into a reckless impulse. He stood up and marched toward the stage. Just as his foot hit the first step, his wrist was grabbed with crushing force. Clara had come down from the stage. She gripped him so hard he could feel the bones grinding. "Let go," Julian hissed, his voice shaking. Clara didn't even look at him. She nodded to the restless crowd. "Apologies, my assistant just needs to confirm some details with me." With that, she ignored his struggles and forced him out of the seminar hall. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise. In the dim light of the corridor, they were alone. Julian wrenched his hand away, his eyes bloodshot, his chest heaving. "Clara, you just told the whole world I'm a worthless clerk. What the hell am I to you?" His voice cracked, but he wouldn't let the tears fall. Clara stared at him silently, her expression unreadable in shadows. Just as Julian thought she was going to give him another cold lecture, she took a step forward. She put one hand around his neck and the other on his cheek. Then, she tilted her head up and pressed her cool lips against his. It was a brief, dry contact. There was no passion, no heat. Julian froze. His mind went blank, his blood turning to ice. Clara pulled back slightly, looking at his stunned face. Her lips moved. "Does this make you feel better? Can we stop making a scene now?" He stared at her, horrified. He had spent 10 years chasing her, dreaming of this closeness, even accepting a marriage of guilt just to stay near her. He had craved her touch so desperately. And now, the kiss he had waited for had arrived as a bribe. She had kissed him just to stop him from ruining Leo's big moment. A tidal wave of shame washed over him, far worse than the public humiliation. Slap! The sound of the strike rang out in the empty hallway. Julian had used every ounce of his strength. His palm stung. Clara's head snapped to the side. A vivid red handprint appeared on her pale cheek. She stood there, frozen, as if she couldn't believe he had actually hit her. Julian's eyes were red, but he still wouldn't let the tears fall. His voice shook violently. Every word spat through clenched teeth. "You think I did all this for that? Clara Sterling, you disgust me." Clara stood paralyzed, her face burning. She looked at Julian's eyes, filled with total, shattered disappointment, and found she couldn't say a word. Julian didn't look at her again. He turned and threw open the door. He didn't go back to the seminar. He didn't stay to argue about the truth. None of it mattered anymore. The light in the hallway was blinding. He wiped his face aggressively with his sleeve. He went straight back to the lab, logged into the system, and with no hesitation, selected all the raw data for the project. He deleted it all, permanently. Even as he left, he wasn't going to let Leo Crawford succeed on the back of academic fraud. A few hours later, Julian was at Logan International Airport. The intercom was announcing his gate. He picked up his single suitcase and walked through the terminal without looking back. As the plane climbed into the sky, Julian blocked Clara on every platform. He had finally put a period on the 10-year sentence of his love. Clara stood in the hallway, staring at the spot where Julian had disappeared. He had hit her. Julian, the man who was always so careful around her he barely breathed, had slapped her with everything he had. She could still see his eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was a desperate, crushed hopelessness mixed with profound humiliation. And his eyes, red and wet, but refusing to cry. Why? She had just wanted him to calm down, to prevent a scene that would have been impossible to fix. That kiss. She had thought it was the fastest, most direct way to stop him. She thought, wasn't that what he always wanted? To be close to her? To touch her? She had given it to him. Why was he angrier than before? Dr. Sterling. Leo's voice came from the door. He poked his head out, his eyes still a bit red. Is everything okay? Is Julian? Clara snapped back to reality, pushing down the strange emotion rising in her chest. It's fine, she interrupted. Finish your presentation. She walked back into the hall and forced herself to focus on Leo's words. But Julian's bloodshot, hateful eyes kept flashing in her mind. After the seminar, Leo tried to talk to her, but she brushed him off. She needed to be alone. She went back to her office and tried to work on her backlog, but her productivity was abysmal. The text on the screen seemed to morph into Julian's pale face. What am I to you? A tool. Clara Sterling, you disgust me. His questions echoed in her ears. She took out her phone and dialed his number. We're sorry. The number you have dialed is not in service. Blocked? She frowned and tried again. Still nothing. A faint, nagging anxiety began to coil around her heart like a vine. She rarely called him. Usually, he was the one reporting every detail of his schedule to her. She realized she didn't even know his dorm room number without having to stop and think about it. She decided to go to the dorms. Some things needed to be said in person. About the paper, about the kiss, about the wedding. She walked to the old dorm building and knocked on the door to 402. No answer. She knocked harder, but the room remained silent. The door across the hall opened, and a researcher she didn't recognize poked his head out. He looked nervous when he saw her. Dr. Sterling? Are you looking for Julian Vance? He doesn't live here anymore. Clara's heart sank. Do you know where he went? The man shook his head. No idea. Clara stood there, realizing for the first time that if Julian didn't want to be found, she had no idea where to look. For 10 years, he had been the one following her, waiting outside her lab, being a constant in her life. She had grown accustomed to him as if he were air or water, essential, but entirely taken for granted. Now that the air was gone, she felt a sudden, suffocating emptiness. She went back to her office and tried every way to reach him. The internal system showed he was on leave, but the reason was blank. She sent an assistant to check the townhouse, only for the agent to report the house had already been sold and the new owners had moved in. He had vanished, right after she had publicly denied him and then given him that kiss. A panic she had never felt before began to gnaw at her nerves. She remembered the look in his eyes. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a goodbye. The realization felt like someone had squeezed her heart. 2 days passed. Julian was still unreachable. Leo had come by several times, but she had brushed him off with excuses. She was more silent than usual, her cold aura so intense that even her assistants were afraid to approach her. She buried herself in work, tried to numb herself with data, but her thoughts would wander. Then, her eyes caught the calendar on the corner of her desk. Tomorrow's date was circled in red. The wedding day. It hit her like a physical blow. Tomorrow was supposed to be her and Julian's wedding. When they had set the date, she hadn't felt much. It was just another appointment in her schedule. She had even thought of it as a chore, something that would take up time and require dealing with guests. She had figured a wedding was a fair way to pay back the debt she owed him from the kidnapping. Marriage, to her, was just a legal status. Life wouldn't change. But now, looking at that red circle, Clara's heart skipped a beat. Tomorrow. Maybe she would see him tomorrow. He would be in his tuxedo, waiting for her. She could imagine him, nervous, hopeful, his eyes bright, looking only at her. The image brought a strange, unfamiliar flutter to her chest. It was a tiny, faint spark of hope. The wedding she had seen as a burden was now the only certain lead she had to see him again. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. We're sorry. The number you have dialed is not in service. She hung up, her fingers trembling slightly. Tomorrow. Just wait until tomorrow at the venue. He'll be there. He had worked so hard to be with her. How could he give up on the wedding? Yes, he would come. And what would she say? Apologize? Explain? Or, like always, would he just come back to her the moment she showed him a little attention? Clara leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The phantom pain of the slap seemed to tingle on her cheek, accompanied by the memory of his eyes. But either way, she would see him tomorrow. That thought was the only thing keeping the rising panic at bay. For the first time in her life, she was actually looking forward to the next day. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke up early. On the drive to the hotel, she rehearsed what she would say. An apology was necessary, though she wasn't entirely sure what for, denying him publicly, the kiss, or everything she had ignored before. But she was sure that once she showed her intent, he would understand. After all, it was Julian. He was always there, waiting for her. When she arrived at the hotel, the expected floral arches and welcome signs were missing. The lobby was eerily quiet. She frowned and walked toward the entrance, but was stopped by the hotel manager. Ma'am, how can I help you? I'm Clara Sterling, she said. There is a wedding banquet here today. The manager checked his tablet, his face shifting into a look of professional apology. I'm very sorry, Dr. Sterling. The wedding ceremony was canceled 5 days ago by Mr. Julian Vance. Clara stood frozen in the lobby, the light of the crystal chandeliers making her vision swim. She realized then that from the venue selection to the menu and the invitations, she hadn't touched a single detail. She had just signed her name on the final authorization form, not even remembering what day she had done it. It was Julian who had gone back and forth, confirming every detail, trying to consult with her while she had answered with whatever, you decide, and don't bother me with trifles. And so, he had canceled the whole thing, without her even knowing. She didn't know how she got back to the lab. She sat in her office, staring out the window, experiencing a profound, groundless sense of loss. What was wrong with her? It was just a formal ceremony that had been canceled. It was just a man who followed her around who had disappeared. Compared to her years of goal-oriented, disciplined life, this should have been insignificant. So why did the space in her chest feel like a hollowed-out cavern filled with a freezing wind? Knock, knock, knock. A knock at the door broke her trance. Leo walked in. Dr. Sterling, I need to pull the original process data for the comparison analysis. Clara snapped back, pushing down her irritation. Data? She remembered Julian saying he kept a backup of all critical data for her. I'll look for it, she said curtly. She went to the filing cabinet, but when she opened it, she froze again. The cabinet was no longer the neatly categorized, clearly labeled masterpiece of organization she remembered. It was a mess. Folders from different projects were mixed together. Unfiled papers were shoved into gaps. She realized Julian hadn't been there to organize it for a week. Usually, she just had to say what she needed, and Julian would pull it from the shelves and hand it to her within seconds. She began to dig through the files, her patience wearing thin. The more she couldn't find it, the more her frustration grew, mixed with a longing for that familiar presence she didn't want to admit to. Leo stood by, watching her struggle. His eyes flickered. Julian really should have. Even if he was upset, he should have finished the handover. This data is critical. If it's gone, the whole project stalls. Clara's hand stopped. Her voice was flat. I'm the one who put him in charge of that data. If it's missing, it's my responsibility. Leo's face went pale, and he went silent. Clara ignored him and kept searching. Finally, in a corner, she found some printed copies of the data, but the most important core logs and the digital backups were nowhere to be found. She suddenly remembered that Julian kept a copy on his work computer as well. She stood up and marched to the neighboring cubicle, Julian's old desk. The desk was too clean. Besides the standard-issue computer and a few neglected, wilting succulents, there were no personal items left. It was as if the owner had just stepped out but would never return. Clara turned on the computer and entered the password. It was her birthday. Her heart felt a sharp prick. She found the encrypted folder and clicked. It was empty. Her breath hitched. He had deleted it. He had actually deleted the raw data they had spent months on, the data he had cherished like a treasure. In that moment, Clara Sterling truly, deeply panicked. A sense of terror she had never known gripped her heart, leaving her more helpless than any academic problem ever could. As she stared at the empty screen, two researchers walked past, chatting. Hey, did you hear Julian Vance transferred to the New Mexico field office? It's pretty rough out there. Yeah, definitely not as nice as Boston, but he volunteered for the regional development project. It's noble, I guess. Clara's head snapped up, her pupils shrinking. When the plane landed, the afternoon sun was fierce, stabbing through the cabin window. Julian grabbed a small suitcase and walked out of the airport, the dry, desert wind carrying the scent of dust and heat. He squinted and pulled up the collar of his windbreaker. The scenery blurred past the taxi window, vast, open skies over rolling tan hills, punctuated by lonely windbreaks and low-slung adobe buildings. A wild, prehistoric silence had replaced the constant hum of Boston. The field office was on the edge of town. The walls were a bit weathered, and the gray buildings stood in stark contrast to the modern glass towers of the Boston headquarters. He was met by Mrs. Gable from administration, a warm, middle-aged woman. You must be Julian Vance. You've had a long trip. She led him toward the residential wing. The conditions aren't what you're used to back east, but it's what we've got. It's remote and a bit old, so don't be too hard on us. It's fine. I like it, Julian said. His room was at the end of the second floor. It was a single with a private bath, simple furniture, and a very clean feel. There was a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, and a stubborn-looking cactus on the windowsill. Rest up and get settled. No rush on the work. I'll show you around tomorrow. Mrs. Gable said before leaving. Julian pushed open the window. A dusty breeze blew in. In the distance were the rugged mountain peaks, and the sky was a deep, impossible blue. There was no Clara Sterling here. No Leo Crawford. None of the suffocating stares or whispers. He shook his head and began to unpack his few belongings. That afternoon, Julian decided to check the archives. The field office was small, and the archive room was in a corner of the first floor, filled with old maps and blueprints. The woman in charge was an older lady named Martha, with white hair and reading glasses. When she saw Julian, she pushed her glasses up and gave a bright smile. A new face. You the one from back east? Yes, ma'am. I am Julian Vance. Just checked in. Julian Vance. Oh, right. The hotshot from headquarters. Martha slapped her knee. Welcome, welcome. We don't often get Boston royalty out here in this little outpost. Julian gave a non-committal shrug. Martha was a talker. You're just in time. We're shorthanded. There's a project with a mess of data that's been sitting around for ages. As she rambled on about the office gossip, a pair of quick footsteps echoed in the hallway, accompanied by someone humming a tune. Martha, I'm back to annoy you again. I'm done with those hydrologic maps I borrow. The voice arrived before the person. A tall woman in a rugged hiking jacket swept into the room like a gust of wind. Her hair was a bit messy from the wind, but it framed a vibrant, glowing face. She dropped a stack of maps on Martha's desk and then noticed Julian. She froze for a second, then her smile widened. Martha, who's this? Since when do we get new colleagues without me knowing? Her tone was teasing and friendly, not at all annoying. Martha shook her head. This is Julian Vance, just transferred from the main office. She turned to Julian. Julian, this is Riley Thorne. She's out of the New Jersey office originally. Riley immediately stepped forward and offered her hand. Her eyes were clear and honest. Julian Vance? Nice to meet you. I am Reedy. I heard they were sending a data specialist to help us out, but I didn't expect someone so young. Welcome to the middle of nowhere. Her hand was warm and soft, her grip firm, radiating a sense of boundless energy. Julian was a bit taken aback by the sudden familiarity. He gave her hand a quick squeeze and let go. Nice to meet you. Just Julian's fine. Got it, Julian. Good name. Riley laughed, and the conversation kept flowing. It's a bit of a shock at first, I know, but give it time. The sky is big, the people are simple, and there's none of that corporate political nonsense. She spoke fast, her thoughts jumping from the climate to the local food to a funny story about a monitoring station. Julian didn't even need to speak. She was a one-woman show. Anyway, if you need a guide or want to know where the good tacos are, just ask. I've been here a month, and I've pretty much mapped the place out. Julian just nodded, his eyes lingering on her expressive face. She was the polar opposite of Clara Sterling. Clara was permafrost, cold, restrained, and distant. The woman in front of him was like the high noon sun over the desert, bright, direct, and unrefined. From Jersey, he finally managed to ask. The contrast between the Atlantic coast and this dusty land was staggering. Riley grinned. The world's a big place. I heard the research here was fascinating and the culture was unique, so I applied for a stint. Life's about the experience, right? She waved the maps in her hand. Anyway, I'll let you get settled. Don't let me keep you from the archives. If you need a scout, you know where to find me. With that, she waved to Martha and vanished back into the hallway, leaving a lingering sense of vitality in the air. Martha chuckled. That girl. She never stops. Julian didn't say anything. He turned to the shelves and began looking for the background materials he needed. When Julian returned to his dorm, night had fallen. The desert nights came fast and cold. He didn't turn on the light. Outside the window, there were no glowing neon signs of Boston, only a few scattered lights in the dark. But above him was an endless canopy of stars, spread out like crushed diamonds on black velvet. He remembered the Boston sky, always a muddy reddish gray from the light pollution. He remembered the tiny window in Clara's lab lounge that offered only a sliver of sky. He had once thought that seeing her world through that tiny window was enough. Now he stood before an infinite sea of stars. On a Sunday morning, a shuttle bus rattled across the desert. Julian sat by the window, taking the weekend to explore the surrounding area. The town was tiny, just a main street and a few shops. He pushed open the door to a small bookstore. A bell chimed. The shop was quiet, with only the owner and a middle-aged woman in glasses talking at the counter. With Mr. Miller in the hospital, the kids' science classes have just stopped. They're so disappointed. Julian's fingers stopped on a book spine. He felt a small spark in his chest. There's no one in town who can sub, the shopkeeper sighed. Julian turned around. The two women looked at the stranger. Excuse me, Julian said, his voice a bit dry in the quiet shop. Do the kids need a science teacher? They both blinked. The teacher pushed her glasses up. And you are? I'm new at the research center in the city. My name is Julian. He paused. If the kids don't mind, I could try to help. The teacher's eyes lit up as if she'd found a lifeline. She grabbed his hand. Oh, Mr. Vance. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. It's just down the street. Let me show you. The school was even humbler than he'd imagined. Cracked walls and a dirt playground. A group of kids were running around, their skin tanned and their eyes bright. The school bell was a manual iron bell. Julian stood at the front of the classroom, 20 pairs of eyes staring at him with curiosity and skepticism. He took a breath and picked up a piece of chalk. Today, we're going to talk about force. He kept his language simple and used practical examples. Seeing their excited faces, a long-forgotten, pure sense of satisfaction from sharing knowledge washed over him. He hadn't been this focused on something for a long time, something done for himself, not for someone else. When the bell rang, the kids swarmed him, calling him Mr. Vance and firing off questions. He answered them patiently, a small smile appearing on his face. As he walked out of the classroom, the sun was bright. He looked up and saw Riley Thorne leaning against a rusty pull-up bar on the playground, her arms crossed, smiling at him. "Not bad, Professor Vance," she called out, her eyes twinkling. Julian was surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Me?" Riley hopped off the bar and walked over. "I'm here every week. I teach PE and art to these rascals." She pointed to a few kids still running around. "Compared to them, I'm already out of breath." She naturally fell into step with him as they headed for the gate. The shuttle bus arrived, shaking as it pulled up. Sitting on the worn seats, Riley pointed out the window. "Over there, see that red ridge? They say there's or down there. Some company tried to mine it years ago, but it didn't pan out. And over there, in a few weeks when it rains, you can see wild burros." She talked a lot, but it wasn't draining. It was full of life. The sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and red, magnificent and lonely. Julian watched in silence, feeling a quiet warmth from the rugged land. Riley's voice was a constant presence next to him. Unlike Clara, she didn't require him to guess her moods or cater to her needs. She was just sharing the world as she saw it. When they got off at the research center, Riley said naturally, "Going back next week? Want to ride together?" Julian hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Yeah." Back in his room, the stars were out again. He thought of the kids' bright eyes and Riley saying, "They like you." A place in his heart that had been barren for too long felt a gentle touch. The field office organized a short trip for sampling in a wind-eroded region. Julian's data team and Riley's geomorphology team happened to be heading the same way, so they shared a van. On the ride, Riley was the life of the party, joking around and making the older scientists laugh. But the moment they hit the site, she transformed. Heavy gear, steep climbs, she was always the first one to shoulder a pack or scramble up a ridge. She'd set the anchors and then reach back to pull up the others. She handed out water, reminded everyone to stay hydrated in the heat, and looked after an older researcher, letting him handle the data entry on flat ground. "I didn't realize Riley was so reliable," one of the professors noted to Julian. Julian watched her. She was kneeling on the ground, carefully scraping sediment from a rock crevice, her face focused, a bead of sweat rolling down her temple. It was a stark contrast to her usual self. He said nothing, but he worked harder on his own environmental logs. On the way back, the sky turned dark without warning. Within 10 minutes, a wall of yellow dust replaced the horizon. "Dust storm," the driver yelled, slamming on the brakes. The wind howled, and visibility dropped to less than 30 feet. The world turned a murky orange. Riley's voice rose above the wind, calm and clear. "We're not safe here. The wind might bury the van. I know a sheltered ridge nearby. Everyone, grab your gear and follow me. Stay close. Do not let the person in front of you out of your sight." She kicked the door open. The wind roared in, choking them with sand. She led the way, half carrying the older researcher. Julian muffled his face with a scarf and followed. In the chaos, a warm, strong hand grabbed his wrist. It was Riley. She said nothing, just pulled him through the sand, using her body to shield him from the worst of the wind. After a few minutes of struggling, they reached a massive rock formation. The wind died down instantly. "Get down, curl up to stay warm, and keep your surface area small," Riley commanded, digging into her pack. She pulled out spare scarves and goggles, handing them to those who weren't prepared. When she got to Julian, he reached for the scarf, but she was already unfurling it, carefully wrapping it around his head and tucking it in. She was quick and professional, with no lingering touch. She then took her post to the edge of the group, watching the storm. The storm lasted an hour. When the sky cleared to a dusty gray, everyone was covered in sand but safe. Back at the center, it was late. After the head count, Riley and Julian walked toward the dorms. The air was still. At the entrance, Riley stopped. Her face was dusty, but her eyes were serious. "Julian, you were really calm today." Julian brushed sand from his hair. "You handled it well. You seem used to this." Riley's eyes flickered, and she gave a casual shrug. Yeah, I've done a lot of wandering. Experience comes from making mistakes, right? She glanced down at her watch. It was a high-end, minimalist piece that looked out of place in the desert. Julian didn't pry. Thanks for today. Don't mention it, Riley said, her bright personality returning. Get some sleep. See you tomorrow. The news broke on Monday morning. The internal portal posted a formal disciplinary notice. Leo Crawford, research fellow, terminated for academic misconduct. Dr. Clara Sterling, lead scientist, issued an official warning for failure in team supervision. The news hit the field office like a stone in a pond. At breakfast in the cafeteria, Julian could hear the younger researchers whispering at the next table. I heard he stole the raw data from that big journal paper. Crazy bold. Even Dr. Sterling got hit. A warning on her record? That's going to sting. Whose data was it? He didn't name names. Who else? The guy who was on Sterling's team. The one who just transferred here. He's sitting right over there. Voices dropped as eyes darted toward Julian, who was eating alone by the window. Julian acted as if he heard nothing, continuing to sip his coffee. He spent the entire day in the field. The desert sun was brutal, and the wind was relentless. Julian wore his hat and goggles, working with his team to pull measuring tapes and collect samples. He was fast and focused. When sweat ran down his face, he just wiped it away, his attention never leaving his compass and logs. During a break, a younger colleague couldn't help but bring up the news. Julian, that data was yours. Now that he's fired, at least there's some justice. Julian took a drink of water, his voice level. It was handled according to protocol. Let's keep moving. We need to finish this site. He stood up and headed for the next observation point. His pace was steady, showing no sign of the man whose name was at the center of the scandal. The team exchanged looks of surprise. Julian Vance was almost eerily stable. As the sun began to set, the survey van rattled back to the center. Julian hopped out, stretching his neck. He was about to say goodbye to his colleagues when his eyes caught a figure standing under a bare cottonwood tree near the gate. He froze. It was Clara Sterling. She stood there, looking at him with the intensity of a traveler in the desert who had finally found water. The noise of the van and the voices of his colleagues seemed to fade into the background. Julian felt his heart tighten, then release, leaving a hollow ache. He hadn't expected to see her here. It had been nearly a month since he sent that "I can't" text. The air seemed to thicken. It was his colleague, Jim, who spoke first. Dr. Sterling? What brings you out here? Clara didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked on Julian. He didn't move toward her. He stood his ground, meeting her gaze with a face as blank as a stranger's. There was no anger, no shock, just the same calm he might show a passerby. That silence was harder for Clara to bear than a shouting match. She would have preferred him to scream at her. Anything was better than this total detachment. Julian finally spoke. Dr. Sterling, if this is professional business, please coordinate with the administration office for an appointment. If it's personal, he paused, meeting her shrinking pupils. I don't believe we have any personal matters left to discuss. He walked past her without waiting for a response, heading straight for the dorms. Clara stood paralyzed, the apology she had rehearsed for weeks dying in her throat, turning into a bitter lump of regret. Julian didn't slow down. He shut his dorm room door with a soft click, locking out the world. He had thought seeing her might stir something in him, but there was only exhaustion and a profound, numb peace. The next day, he woke up early to avoid her at breakfast. But when he finished his morning data work and walked out of the archives, she was there at the end of the covered walkway. She looked as if she hadn't slept. The moment she saw him, she stood up straight, her voice dry and raspy. Julian stopped a few feet away. His silence forced her to speak. She took a step forward, tried to close the gap. I know. I was wrong. I ignored how you felt. She struggled with the words. They were foreign to her. The paper, and what happened at the seminar. I am sorry. She took a breath, looking him in the eye. Her usually cold eyes were swirling with emotion. I didn't realize until you were gone. I can't do this without you. This past month has been. Dr. Sterling, Julian interrupted. There was no emotion in his voice. I hear your apology, but it's unnecessary. Clara froze. This wasn't the reaction she expected. No tears, no rage, nothing. It wasn't just about Leo or a paper credit, Julian continued. The problem is that to you, Julian Vance wasn't a person. I was a fixture. You were used to me. You use me like people use air or water. You don't think about it until it's gone and you're suffocating. He tilted his head, his gaze clinical. You're hurting now, but not because you love me. You're hurting because you lost a high-quality, long-term accessory. You love your own comfort, Clara, Not me. The words were like ice water poured over her head. She wanted to argue, to deny it, but in the face of his blunt honesty, she found she had no defense. She started, but her throat was too tight. Please don't come looking for me for personal reasons again. It's a distraction to the work. He turned and walked away. Clara stood in the silence, watching him go, realizing for the first time that she really had lost him forever. A sense of panic and emptiness began to eat at her heart. Julian headed for the cafeteria, grabbed some food, and sat in a corner. Rough night? Or did the coyotes keep you up? A cheerful voice sounded across from him. Julian looked up to see Riley Thorne setting her tray down. She was wearing a gray windbreaker, her hair a bit messy from the wind, her smile bright. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world. Julian forced a small smile. I'm Phoenix. Right? Your eyebrows are practically knitted together. Look, I'm heading out to the North Slope this afternoon. There's a wind-eroded formation there that doesn't match the textbooks. Want to come? It beats staring at a screen all day. She didn't ask what happened. She just offered an escape. I won't let it interfere with work. Call it a preliminary scout. She always had a reason, and her energy was contagious. Julia nodded. Okay. That afternoon, Riley drove them out in a Jeep, blasting local folk music and tapping the wheel. Look over there, she said, pointing. See that ridge? Looks like a whale's back, doesn't it? Nature's the best sculptor. Julian looked out at the red rock and the deep shadows of the canyons. It was beautiful and harsh. It's dry now, but millions of years ago, this was a massive lake. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. She parked on a rise and led him up a slope, pointing out rock layers. See this? It's a record of ancient climate. Every layer is a story. Compared to time, our own drama is pretty small. When things get bad, look at the horizon. It helps. Julian held a piece of fossil she'd handed him, feeling the cool stone. He said nothing, but the tension in his shoulders finally began to melt. On the drive back, Riley didn't push him to talk about his feelings. She just told him about local legends and the best place to get steak in the next town over. The comfortable silence was broken by the radio. All units, deep observation well 3 is down. Emergency repairs needed immediately. Riley grabbed the mic. Unit 7 on it. We're 5 minutes away. She turned to Julian. That's a critical point. If the data stream breaks, the whole model is compromised. Julian didn't hesitate. I'll go with you. I need to see the data flow anyway. When they reached the site, Clara Sterling was already there. She looked pale, her breathing shallow, signs of altitude sickness, but she was struggling to check the wellhead. Her eyes darkened when she saw Julian and Riley arrive together. Status? Riley asked, jumping out of the Jeep. Clara's voice was strained. The seal failed. The bolts are rusted shut. They won't budge. She tried to use a wrench, but her hands were shaking and the tool slipped, nearly hitting her. Careful, Riley said, taking the tool. Don't force it. You'll snap the head. Bill, get the penetrant and the torque wrench. She worked with a practiced efficiency, barking orders to Julian. Julian, check the specs on the backup seals. We need the pressure rating. Julian flipped through the manual. Matches. It's rated for this depth. A sudden gust of wind sent dust swirling. Clara began to cough violently, her legs buckling. Riley caught her by the arm. Dr. Sterling, go to the Jeep. The altitude is hitting you. We got this. Clara wanted to refuse, but her head was spinning. She leaned against the car, watching Riley and Julian. They moved in sync, Julian handing over tools, recording parameters, and Riley handling the heavy mechanical work. They were fast and focused. Clara watched, a lump forming in her throat. She remembered Julian doing the same for her back in Boston, meticulous and steady, but she had never truly seen him. Now that he was gone, he was no longer a shadow. He had a light of his own that was almost too bright to look at. Done. Test it, Riley shouted. The indicator light on the panel turned green. The data curve on the screen smoothed out. Everyone exhaled. The ride back was quiet. Clara sat in the back with her eyes closed. Riley drove, occasionally glancing at Julian in the mirror. He was looking out at the vast, dark desert, his profile softened by the twilight. Thanks for today, Julian said softly. Riley grinned. Just doing my job. But seriously, you're better with your hands than most of the office guys I know. Julian looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips. Practical is always better than theoretical. Riley laughed. I like that. You're a straight shooter. I can work with that. When they arrived at the dorms, Riley helped unload the gear. Data review tomorrow morning? Want to go over the specs? Sure, Julian said. He watched her walk away before heading inside. The desert night didn't feel as cold when he had someone to talk to. Back in the car, Clara opened her eyes and watched Riley's disappearing Jeep. Her heart felt heavy. She had tried to prove she didn't need Julian for the repair, but she had only succeeded in looking incompetent. The following weekend, the center had a small get-together in the cafeteria. Some of the older staff brought out homemade cider, and the atmosphere was festive. Riley was in the middle of it, laughing and making bets on a game of cards. Julian sat in a corner, chatting with a colleague, more relaxed than he had been in years. "Julian, come on. Have a drink," someone called out, handing him a glass. Before he could refuse, Riley cut in. "Leave him alone, Jim. We have field sampling tomorrow at dawn. He needs a clear head for the data. I'll drink his share." She downed the glass to a round of cheers. She winked at Julian. He looked down, a genuine smile tugging at his lips. Clara sat at another table, her knuckles white. Riley was like a wildfire, bright and hot, and it made Clara feel like a block of ice. She drank her own glass, the liquid burning her throat, but it didn't touch the coldness in her heart. After the party, Julian went outside for some air. The sky was clear, the Milky Way a brilliant stripe across the heavens. "Stargazing?" Riley asked, coming up behind him. She handed him a warm can of almond milk. "Drink this. It'll help with the chill." "Thanks." Julian felt the warmth through the can. They stood in silence for a while. "I think you're pretty amazing," Riley said, her voice lower than usual. "Moving from Boston to here, not many people could handle it without complaining." She looked at the stars. "I heard. You used to work for the DR. Sterling." Julian stiffened slightly, but didn't deny it. Riley continued, "I'm from Jersey. My family owns Thorn Industries. Not that it matters." She sounded casual about it. "I have older siblings to run the company. I just wanted to look at rocks. My family didn't get it." She looked at him. "I get what it's like to want to break away. From a relationship that smothers you, or a life that's already been written for you." Julian gripped the can. Suddenly, footsteps crunched on the gravel behind them. Clara stood there, her face pale and her eyes red from the cider. Riley frowned and stepped slightly in front of Julian. Julian gently touched her arm, signaling her to stay back. Clara stumbled toward them. "Julian, come back with me. You can have whatever you want. Let on any project. First author. I'll give it all to you. Don't stay here with people who don't know who you are. She can't give you the future you deserve." Julian looked at her. The woman he had once worshipped was now a pathetic wreck. "Clara," he said, his voice firm, "you still don't get it. I don't love you. The day you publicly denied my worth for Leo was the day we ended." Julian turned to Riley. "Let's go." Riley nodded and they walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the dark. After a bit, Riley cleared her throat. "So, I'm not exactly a person of unknown origin. I'd give you my bio." Julian finally laughed. Riley Thorn, of Thorn Industries." "Hey," she said, bumping his shoulder. "Out here, I'm just Riley. Don't go total executive on me." She paused, her voice softening. Did I say too much back there?" Julian stopped. In the moonlight, her eyes were clear. "You mean about knowing about the kidnapping? And why I really left?" Riley took a breath. "Yeah, I heard the rumors before I came out here. They said you were a rising star who threw it away. I was curious, so I looked it up. Until the dust storm," she said. "When I saw you protecting the sample bags, even when you were choking on sand, you weren't protecting your career. You were protecting the truth." Julian looked down at his hands. He thought about the last month, and how Riley had always happened to be there with a warm drink, or a funny story, or a hand with the gear. He looked at her. Her eyes were honest. No pity, no debt. Just respect. "You know," he said softly, "you're the first person since I came here who didn't use the word waste when talking about my transfer. Everyone else thought he was throwing his life away." "Waste?" Riley's eyes widened. "To do real science in a place like this? That's not a waste. A flower in a greenhouse is nice, but it left." Riley took a breath. "Yeah, I heard the rumors before I came out here. They said you were a rising star who threw it away. I was curious, so I looked it up. Until the dust storm," she said. "When I saw you protecting the sample bags, even when you were choking on sand, you weren't protecting your career. You were protecting the truth." Julian looked down at his hands. He thought about the last month, and how Riley had always happened to be there with a warm drink, or a funny story, or a hand with the gear. He looked at her. Her eyes were honest. No pity, no debt. Just respect. "You know," he said softly, "you're the first person since I came here who didn't use the word waste when talking about my transfer. Everyone else thought he was throwing his life away." "Waste?" Riley's eyes widened. "To do real science in a place like this? That's not a waste. A flower in a greenhouse is nice, but a desert shrub that can survive a decade of drought? That's what's impressive." She spoke so fast she turned a little red, then looked at him with a spark in her eye. "So, give me a chance?" Let's be desert shrubs together. We can do real work and watch the sun come up over the ridges. The wind brushed past them. Julian looked at her and felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. Okay. Riley's face lit up like a million stars. She reached out to touch his arm, then hesitated, finally just nodding frantically. It's a deal. No takebacks. Before she could say anything else, Mrs. Gable ran up to them. Julian, Riley, emergency orders. A joint expedition is heading to Black Canyon tomorrow. They want both of you. Geology and data integration. You'll be out there for several days. Pack heavy. Got it, Riley said. Mrs. Gable added. Oh, and headquarters sent a specialist to assist. Dr. Sterling volunteered. She'll be with your convoy. Riley's smile faded, and she looked at Julian. Julian's face remained calm. Understood. He looked at Riley and gave her a small, encouraging smile. See you at 0600. We'll do this together. See you then, Riley said, her energy returning. I'll bring breakfast. The next morning, the convoy headed out. Riley hopped out of the Jeep and handed Julian a warm coffee and a breakfast burrito. Eat up. It's going to be a bumpy ride. On the drive, Riley explained the terrain, her fingers occasionally brushing his as she pointed things out on the maps. Julian didn't pull away this time. When they reached the canyon and started work, Riley checked Julian's safety harness herself. She leaned in, her breath warm. The shale is loose here. Step where I step. Julian nodded, his heart beating a little faster. Clara stood nearby, but the team lead called her over to check a different ridge. She could only watch them from a distance. Have some fruit, Riley said during a break, handing him a container of melon. Gold in the desert. She held a piece out to him. Julian hesitated, then leaned in and ate it. Clara, standing a few yards away, gripped her water bottle until her knuckles turned white. She walked over, her voice tight. Julian, I found some anomalies in the depth readings. I need to cross-reference the parameters with you. Dr. Sterling, let him finish his lunch first, Riley said firmly. Clara pulled out her notebook. The pH levels are off. It could ruin the model. She crowded into Julian's space. Riley stepped in, her tone polite but unyielding. The data isn't going anywhere. Eating is more important. Unless you missed the layer stratigraphy while you were looking at the pH. I'm being thorough, Clara snapped. Thorough is good, Riley smiled. But skipping lunch leads to decimal errors. Right, Julian? Julian glanced at the notebook. The values are fine. It's the depth variance I noted in the log. Check the first 3 pages. Riley gave a small, satisfied smirk. Clara went silent, her fingers gripping the pen. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed from the cliffs above. Rocks began to clatter down the slope. Landslide! Get to the clearing, the leader shouted. Riley moved instantly, grabbing Julian's wrist and pulling him toward the pre-designated safety zone. But Clara did the opposite. She ran back toward the equipment, where Julian's core samples and original data logs were. Clara, no, get out of there, Julian yelled. But she was already in the path of the falling debris. Just as she grabbed the equipment case, a boulder the size of a basketball came crashing down. She managed to shove the case toward the safety zone, but she couldn't clear the path herself. The rock hit her squarely in the back. She collapsed, blood trickling from her forehead. Julian tried to run to her, but Riley held him back. More are coming. Wait for a gap. The sliding slowed for a second. Riley didn't hesitate. She sprinted out, checking Clara's pulse. Leg might be broken. Back injury. Don't move her yet. Clara looked past Riley at Julian's pale face. Riley shoved a heavy stone off Clara's leg. As she bent down to lift Clara, a stray rock caught Riley's arm, slicing a deep gash through her sleeve. Blood sprayed onto the sand. Riley hissed in pain, but didn't let go. She hoisted Clara up and carried her to the safety of the medical van. What? Clara whispered, her voice fading. Riley set her down and turned to Julian with a weary smile. Her own arm was soaked in blood. Her voice was soft but clear. I didn't want Julian to owe you anything, and I didn't want him making a choice out of guilt. Julian looked at Riley's arm, then at Clara's broken form. He followed them into the van in silence. The ride to the county hospital was a tomb of silence. Riley focused on the road, occasionally checking Julian in the mirror. He was staring out the window at the setting sun, his face unreadable. In the ER, as the doctors tended to Clara, Julian stood at the end of the hall. Riley leaned against the wall, her arm bandaged, but her eyes still on him. Let me help you with that, Julian said, taking a fresh bandage and some antiseptic from a nurse. He walked over to Riley. She pulled back instinctively, then let him take her arm. She winced as the medicine touched the cut. Hurts? He asked gently. Riley shook her head, but she wouldn't look away from him. Her voice was a whisper. Julian, are you going to go back to her? Because she saved your data? Because she's hurt. Julian stopped. Riley's ears were red, and she looked like a kid who was afraid of getting in trouble. She almost died for you, she whispered. I'd understand if you softened. Julian looked at her and smiled. He tapped her nose with a finger. You were so worried about that, and yet you still risked your life to pull her out? Riley scrambled to explain. I'm not a monster. I just didn't want you to feel like you were in her debt. She chose to save the data, but you shouldn't have to choose her because of it. Riley, Julian said, his voice steady. I'm grateful for the data, and I'm glad she's going to be okay. But gratitude isn't love. They aren't the same thing. He finished the bandage and looked her in the eye. 10 years was enough time to see if someone loves me. Guilt, habit, control, those aren't love. He stood up. The words she said today, they were moving, but they were too late. When a wound scar is over, you don't tear it open again. He looked toward the room where Clara lay. He could see her through the glass, her face like paper. He heard a faint sob from inside, a small, broken sound. He watched for a second, then turned back to Riley and smiled. The 10-year obsession was finally, truly over. He walked with Riley toward the exit. Clara woke up to the sound of the wind. Julian? He's gone, Clara, the doctor said softly. He made sure you were stable, and then he left with the other researcher. Clara looked at the ceiling. She had saved his data. She had bled for him. She had finally said she loved him, and it hadn't changed a thing. She realized then that Julian hadn't been waiting for an apology or a grand gesture. He had just been waiting for the strength to leave. 3 months later, Julian's Desert Ecosystem Initiative was approved as a national project. Riley spent every night in the lab with him, singing off-key and making him laugh until the night shift security guard told them to quiet down. The following spring, they took a vacation. Riley pored over maps. Iceland, the Sahara, the Amazon. Julian pointed to a tiny, nameless island in the South Pacific. On a beach in the Cook Islands, Riley suddenly dropped to one knee. She pulled a soda can ring from her pocket. The diamond fell in the ocean. Use this for now. I'll get the real one when the tide goes out. Julian laughed and held out his hand. It'll do. As the water washed over their feet, she pulled a real ring from her other pocket. Her eyes were brighter than the stars. Julian Vance, want to spend a lifetime seeing the parts of the map no one else visits. He kissed her, the salt air tasting like happiness. He eventually received an email from Clara. Attached was the official award list for the Desert Project. His name was first, followed by Riley's. The body of the email was just a photo. Clara Sterling, alone under the northern lights in Greenland, a peaceful smile on her face. Julian felt a pair of arms wrapped around his waist. Dreaming about work again? Riley mumbled, sleepy-eyed. Julian smiled and closed the laptop. He pulled her into a hug. The desert stars were a memory now, replaced by the Southern Cross over the lagoon. Riley squeezed him tight, and Julian knew he was finally home. Story complete.